Hi everyone. I'd like to introduce you to Reaticulate, an articulation management system for REAPER. In this video, we're going to take a look at what it can do and how you can install it. And then a little bit later, we'll dig into how it works. In front of us here, you can see a couple patches from Spitfire with several articulations. And then on the right, which is the Reaticulate GUI, you can see a couple sections that map onto the patches to the left here. If we take a look at the track configuration, you can see a couple banks. Each bank describes one of the patches and the articulations they have to offer. Easiest way to activate articulations is just click on them. There's a few other actions you can use to activate articulations as well. Here we have a MIDI excerpt that has a flute figure that shows a number of articulation switches. You can see those as we play through it. The Spitfire patches here will update as well, but also the Reaticulate GUI will update in real time as we play the figure. In the MIDI editor, the individual articulations here are shown as program changes. Program changes are the basic unit of articulation change in Reaticulate. The program change events are then processed by a special JSFX plugin that converts the program change to any kind of MIDI event the underlying patch, in this case here Spitfire patches, expect to receive to activate the articulation. You can also step record articulations by enabling step input and then just simply clicking one of the articulation buttons to insert the program change event. So in addition to clicking these buttons here, you can also use several actions that Reaticulate comes with to activate articulations by a CC or individual discrete next and previous actions as well. So if you have a control surface, you can have buttons for next and previous articulations, as well as using an encoder to flip through the articulations in the bank list. Reaticulate can also solve a number of different use cases in addition to the one that I showed you here. This is a standard multi-configuration with different patches on different channels. Reaticulate can take care of routing to the destination channels. It also does CC chasing across the channels and anti-note hanging as well. A little bit more of a sophisticated example here with the Bohemian violin, where you've got different styles here down at the bottom in red that control how the performer behaves, but the articulations here above are independent of these three style ones. So these ones down here are in a group separate from these ones here. And then there's actually this chords articulation, which is a simple toggle, and that's also in a separate group. Okay, so with that, let's take a brief interlude here and show you how you can install Reaticulate. Here we are with a blank project. Now Articulate's installable via Reabank, so if you haven't already done so, head on over to reabank.com and install it for your platform. Once it's installed, you can access it under the Extensions menu, and then under Reabank, import a repository. You can paste the URL in. The URL is in the description field in this video. And then Reaticulate will show up in the list. Double-click it, and then click Install All Packages in this repository. It'll prompt you if you want to install new packages from this repository in the future. Say yes, so that new files that I add will get automatically picked up. Then it's installed. Now Articulate comes with a number of actions that you can bind shortcuts to, but the one that we want to make sure is run every time REAPER is started is this one called Reaticulate main. You can have this automatically started via an SWS startup action or a REAPER startup script, and I'll have documentation on the website on how to do that. For now, let's just manually run it. Now, by default, you'll probably find that Reaticulate is floating, but you can have it docked here by clicking this icon, which will dock it. Now, this docker is not attached to the main window. We'll do that now. I like to drag it onto the right side. So now we have Reaticulate GUI installed on a right-mounted docker. So the UI here says no track is selected. We're going to go ahead and create a track from template, just a simple Kontakt instance. And now it shows that we have the option here, a button to add the Reaticulate FX, which we'll click. It'll install the Reaticulate JSFX to the top of the FX chain. Now we have an option to edit track banks. So we open this Kontakt instance. Let's pull in Chamber Strings Ensembles patch from Spitfire and edit the track banks. Here we can add a bank. Now there's a number of factory banks that come by default. I'll flesh this out over time. Most of the stuff from Spitfire is in there already. So if you find Chamber Strings Ensembles, here we see a note saying set patch to UACC. This is because the bank is configured to send UACC CC32 events. Now as we go back and activate articulations, we can see it changing in the Spitfire patch. Okay, here we are back at the project from earlier. For the rest of this video, we're going to dig in a little bit deeper into the operation of Reaticulate and how you can set up custom banks. Now, for the moment, because this is an alpha release, I haven't done a GUI for creating banks. So unfortunately, you need to edit files. I guess as a Reaper user, you're probably not unfamiliar with that. The easiest way to do that is click this little pencil icon here, and it'll allow you to open the custom Reabank file that Reaticulate uses in editor. If you have .reabank files associated with an application, then Open in Default app will open that. Otherwise, you can edit it in whatever the OS default editor is. Since I do have it, I'll click Open in Default app. Now, when you open this file, it'll be pretty much blank, except for the comments at the top here. I've done a couple banks here for the purposes of this video that we'll go into in a bit. You can also look at the factory Reabank file. I've done quite a number of banks here for various patches, mostly Spitfire, since that's what I use mainly in my template. Let's go through these tracks now one at a time. This is the flute one that we looked at earlier. We look at the configuration here. We see a couple of banks for flute solo legato and flute solo full. This is the underlying configuration for those two flute banks. It's standard Reabank file format, but there's these special comments with exclamation points that control Reaticulate's behavior when the program is activated or how it's presented in the UI. The documentation online goes into all this in excruciating detail, but we're just going to walk through some of the highlights here. C is color, so this is the standard long color. I is the icon. In this case, it's the note hole icon. The full list of available icons and their names is also at the website. The more interesting one is the O parameter, which is the output events that are triggered when this articulation is activated. In this case here, we have one output event. That's a CC output, CC30 to value 1. And this is what the Spitfire patch expects to receive to trigger the long articulation. And it's pretty much the same for this entire patch. It's just the only thing that's different is the colors that we use, the icons, and the specific CC values. In all these cases, it's CC32. Here we see that note configured set patch to UACC that is reflected in the UI when the patch is selected. So if we look now at the Berlin Woodwinds oboe use case that I showed earlier, this is the multi scenario. In this case, here's the configuration for that bank. Here we see all the articulations, and the key difference is the output events. Rather than sending CC32s like the Spitfire patch we looked at a moment ago, this sets up channel routing for the various destination channels. There's no actual output event that's emitted here. It's just routing to these channels 1 through 6 as the programs are activated. So just as a quick example here, if we open up the sustains and legato patches, we can see that we're on legato right now. So if I play something, switch to sustains, pretty straightforward. But note that if I adjust the CC here, CC1, and then reactivate legato, the CC will get chased as the articulation is activated. The other key difference between this track and the previous one is the bank configuration comes from the user menu, since it was in the user-defined Reabank file, as opposed to the factory one. So let's move on to the next track. Here we've got a patch from Cinematic Studio Strings, another one from Spitfire. And this is an interesting case because the Cinematic Studio Strings patch has kind of multiple modes. So we've got legato on-off and concertino on-off, as well as the individual articulations. And the factory banks has a bank for this that treats legato and concertino as different groups that act independently to these main articulations. For this example, we've gone a different route. Here's the configuration for this track here. For this example, we've decided to have single articulations for the various modes. So in this case, we've got legato, which is legato sustains with concertino off. And we can see those 3 separate events here. This one's sending note 12, this one's sending note 22 at velocity 127, and note 23 at velocity 1. And triggering that will set all 3 modes at one time. So here we see suddenly we've gone from concertino on to off, legato off to on, and well, we were on the sustains patch already. And as we go through these, we can see that it's triggering the various modes. Now there's one interesting customization here. In addition to the standard spiccato articulation with the appropriate key switches needed to trigger the patch in CSS, we've also got this custom beefy spiccato articulation that has the same output events, but there's also one more output event here to direct routing to channel 2. So let's take a quick look at the difference, triggering the standard spiccato articulation, routing to the Cinematic Studio Strings patch, and then beefy spiccato will route to both of them. Okay, I'd like to take a moment to talk a bit about channel routing, and here's where things can get a little tricky. So if we look at the channel configuration for this bank here, we see these two boxes. These indicate the source and destination channels. The source channel indicates on which channel the program changes, or that is to say the articulation changes, need to come in on for them to get converted to output events to activate the articulation and the underlying patch. The destination channel is essentially on which channel the patch is listening on, in this case Kontakt. So here we see it set to channel 1. Now the destination channel in this configuration is set to source, which so far has been fine because we've only really been working in channel 1 so far. So when we activate or click one of these articulations, it's set to source channel 1, which corresponds to this, and that gets converted to the same destination channel because that's set to source. We could say it is more technically correct, though, to set this to channel 1, because, for example, if I changed to channel 4, let's say using my MIDI controller, change to channel 4, and then activate, let's say, a long articulation, you can see this little 4 here indicates the source channel that would be mapped to this articulation. So if we click it, we see that it didn't actually change because Reaticulate is sending the output events to channel 4, and there's nobody listening there. Now we see that having activated this articulation on channel 4, we also see the articulation here lingering on channel 1. We'll talk about that in a moment. So to technically fix this issue, we would go back and set the source channel to channel 1 to correspond to the channel that the patch is listening on. And then if we activated this articulation again, you can see that it actually worked this time, and Reaticulate is set up routing from channel 4 to channel 1 on this patch. But there's actually a use case for leaving this set to source. And that is, for example, if we were doing a line with sustains and we wanted to layer in some harmonics. Rather than creating a separate track, we could pull in another instance of this patch on another channel and then just use a different MIDI channel on the same track. So let's do that now. Pull in, actually we'll replace this one. So here we have another instance of the ensembles patch on channel 2. And so this will allow us to independently set up channels 1 and 2 using the same bank configuration here, just a single bank. So if we clear these out, let's set channel 1 to long, which it already is, and then set channel 2 to harmonics, if I can find it. So now if we go back to channel 1, that's playing longs, and if we go to channel 2, that's playing harmonics. Now, if you never intended to do any kind of layering like this, then you could pin the destination channel to channel 1. But on the other hand, if you're confined within a single channel anyway, then there's no harm in just leaving it set to source. Okay, for our next example, we're going to dive back into the Bohemian violin. And this is an interesting example, not just because, as I mentioned at the beginning, we've got these different groups, but also because there's different types of output events. So this is the bank configuration for the Bohemian. It comes with the factory banks. And here we can see these two different types of output events. One is note and one is note hold. Note hold is for non-latching key switches. So the patch expects you to press and hold the key while the articulation is to be activated. And then note is used for latching key switches. So note hold will send the note on event to the patch and defer the note off until the next articulation is activated. Meanwhile, the note output event will send both note on and note off at the same time. So we use note, for example, the styles down here. These are non-latching, or sorry, these are latching. So we use a note output event. And all the other ones up here are non-latching. So those are note hold. So one more thing makes this particularly interesting and tricky, and that is this definition up here in the bank of off. And this indicates what's called an off program. So we've got this program here called Performer, and Performer isn't actually an articulation or anything requiring a key switch with the Bohemian, but Performer is the default behavior of the patch when there's no active articulation. So this is represented in Reaticulate using a special program, which is called the off program. So when we release all notes, we implicitly activate this off program called the Performer, which is what the Bohemian calls its default mode. And then we can use any of these non-latching key switches or these other programs to change the behavior of the Performer and then deactivate them to return back to the Performer by clicking on the Performer articulation. Okay, so that was a mouthful. Let's actually look at this as an example. So here we click on the Performer, and this is the standard, I guess we're on the emotive style now, which is fine. This is the standard behavior of the Bohemian. Now we can activate these articulations by clicking on them with spiccato. And if we click the Performer again, this doesn't actually activate, as I said, any special articulation on the Bohemian. It just releases the held key switch note that's triggering spiccato right now. So this is probably a good time to show how Reaticulate is compatible with parallel use of the actual key switch notes. In this case, the Bohemian uses note-based key switches, and we can trigger those manually as well just by hitting the key switch note on the keyboard, and Reaticulate will reflect the active articulation in the GUI. So in fact, we don't ever really need to open the UI, the native UI for the patch. So for example, here we have Rebo, and we can trigger that manually. The chords key switch was another interesting example of one that is a toggle. So we can toggle that with just by pressing the note for that. So the last example to look at isn't actually all that exciting compared to everything that we've looked at so far. This is the Spitfire First Violins, which has tons of articulations across 4 different combination palettes, as Spitfire calls them. But the actual configuration is pretty standard and similar to what we've seen before. Here we've got the 4 banks corresponding to the 4 patches, and no special channel routing here, just Omni and Source, which are the defaults. And we see the notes here set patch to UACC for all of these banks. All of the factory banks for Spitfire that come with Reaticulate expect the Spitfire patch to be set to UACC. I guess the only other nuance to mention here is because there's so many of them, you actually need to use the scroll wheel to scroll through them all. There's no scroll bar currently in the UI, so you need to use the scroll wheel. Or you can use an encoder on control surface and whip through the articulations that way. And one other small detail you might not have noticed is as you hover over an articulation, you notice at the bottom here it shows in a little tooltip in the status what the articulation is going to do when it's clicked. In this case, it's sending CC32 at different values. Now, if you're still with us, then I congratulate you on your stamina, but we're almost at the finish line. Just a couple more things left. One thing I haven't mentioned yet here is the meaning of these program numbers. Technically, they're arbitrary. You'll notice that here they correspond with the output events. So, for example, CC32 value 10 triggers harmonics, and we happen to have used program 10. That's not a complete accident, although these program numbers are arbitrary. The factory banks have standardized on the UACC specification. So where possible, we map as closely as we can to the UACC spec. So for example, spiccato in the UACC spec is defined as value 42. So we'll use program 42. You don't have to conform to this in your own user banks. And as I say, it is arbitrary. But one benefit of conformity is being able to have a control surface or a tablet or something like that activate specific articulations regardless of the patch that you're on, and regardless, of course, of whether or not it's a Spitfire patch with UACC. So if we look at some of the actions offered by Reaticulate, here we see these activate articulation by CC on channel X. And I've got these bound, or at least channels 1 through 4, to CC119. So if I send from a control surface CC119 value 42, that'll activate program 42, which is spiccato. Here we see I've activated spiccato. And so I've got a number of buttons for all types of different articulations that I can activate directly without having to use, relative next and previous or an encoder to scroll through them. Okay, a couple final bits and bobs here. So when you make changes to the user bank file that we showed earlier, that's this guy here, when you make changes to this file, you need to then click this little reload icon, which will cause Reaticulate to reread the file and sync all the changes to the active track. These MIDI channels here indicate the default channel, which is the channel that when you click on articulation or activate an articulation from one of the actions, here there's an action for activate articulation by CC on default channel. In this case, it'll use the value that's set here as the source channel for that articulation when it's activated. You can filter the list of articulations by typing in a search term in this box, and then it'll filter according to the term that you typed. This is actually Sublime text style filtering, so they don't have to be an exact substring match. In this case, it's found sulpont by this essentially keyboard mash. Hit escape to clear it. And finally, under this cog, there's global settings, which right now there's just one for enabling and disabling debug. Over time, I'll be adding more to this section. Okay, so that should just about do it for this introduction of Reaticulate. I think you'll see that although it's a little rough around the edges in places, it's still pretty functional right now. I'll be interested to hear about your experiences, and if you have any bugs, you can create an issue on the GitHub project page. There'll be a link for that below. In general, you can find documentation or any other information at reaticulate.com. Thanks for watching.